So this happened 6 years ago, but I'm finally ready to talk about it because these people showed up at my house last month, and I need you guys to tell me I'm not losing my mind here. My name is Dean, and I turned 17 on March 15th, 2019. I remember the date because it was supposed to be special, you know? Instead, it became the day my parents, Frederick and Melissa, decided I wasn't worth keeping around anymore. I should probably give you some background first. My parents always treated me differently than my brother Rory. He's 2 years younger, but somehow he was always the golden child. Frederick would take him to baseball games while I stayed home. Melissa bought him new clothes while I got hand-me-downs from cousins. When Rory wanted guitar lessons, they signed him up immediately. When I asked for art supplies, they told me to focus on something practical. I thought it was just normal family dynamics, you know? Some kids get more attention. I figured if I worked harder, got better grades, maybe they'd notice me more. I was pulling straight A's junior year, had a part-time job at the grocery store, saved up over $800. I was even helping pay for groceries sometimes when money got tight. But apparently none of that mattered because on my 17th birthday, instead of cake and presents, Frederick and Melissa sat me down for what they called a family meeting. Frederick started talking about how they'd been discussing my future and they decided I needed to learn responsibility, real responsibility. Then Melissa jumped in with this speech about how I was old enough to make my own way in the world. I'm sitting there thinking they're about to give me more chores or something. Then Frederick drops the bomb. He tells me they want me out of the house by the end of the week, just like that. Happy birthday, pack your bags. I asked them what I did wrong and Frederick got this look on his face like I was being deliberately stupid. He started listing off everything I apparently did wrong over the years. I was too quiet, didn't contribute enough to family conversations, spent too much time alone in my room. Melissa added that I was ungrateful and never showed proper appreciation for everything they did for me. Then Frederick really went off. He told me I was 17 years of disappointment and it was enough, that they were done wasting money on a pathetic loser. Melissa started crying and said I was nothing but a burden, a complete waste of their lives. I asked where I was supposed to go, and Frederick actually laughed. He said under a bridge for all he cared, maybe I'd finally learn what real life was like. The next part still gets me angry. Frederick compared me to Warren Buffett's investment strategy. He said even Warren Buffett knows when to stop throwing good money after bad, and I was a lost cause. Then Melissa told me never to contact them again, that I was nothing to this family. But here's the thing that really showed me what kind of people they were. 3 days later, I'm staying at my friend Beau's place, trying to figure out my life, and I see Rory's Instagram story, pictures of a brand new apartment, thanking mom and dad for helping him get set up. My 15-year-old brother got a whole apartment while I got kicked to the curb. That's when it clicked for me. This wasn't about teaching me responsibility or tough love. They just didn't want me around anymore. They had enough money to set up Rory, but not enough to let me finish high school at home. I never went back to that house. Not once. I finished high school while couch surfing between friends' places and working double shifts at the store. Applied to colleges using Beau's address. Got into a decent state school with partial scholarships and worked my way through. During those years, I learned a lot about myself. Turns out when you're not constantly being told you're a disappointment, you can actually accomplish things. I graduated with a business degree, got into real estate early in a growing market, made some smart investments, built a life for myself that they never thought I was capable of. I kept tabs on them over the years through social media and mutual acquaintances. Frederick bounced between jobs, Melissa worked part-time retail. They were always just getting by, always one emergency away from financial trouble. Rory dropped out of college after 2 semesters and moved back home. Last month I'm at my house. Yeah, I bought a house, 3-bedroom with a nice yard, and I hear shouting outside. I look through the window and there they are, Frederick, Melissa, and Rory, standing on my sidewalk with handmade signs. The signs say things like, "Our son won't help us," and "Family should take care of family." Neighbors are staring. People are slowing down their cars to look. Frederick sees me in the window and starts yelling about how I'm selfish for not helping my own parents when they're struggling. Melissa is crying and holding a sign that says, "We raised you better." The irony was not lost on me. The same people who threw my bags on the street 6 years ago were now on my street demanding help. I didn't go outside. I didn't engage. I just watched them make a spectacle of themselves in front of my neighbors. After about an hour, they packed up their signs and left. But they came back the next day, and the day after that. Update 1. Holy hell, you guys weren't kidding about this escalating fast. Shout out to the commenter who said they'd probably start showing up at my work. You called it perfectly. So where I left off, Frederick, Melissa, and Rory had been showing up at my house with their signs for 3 days straight. I was staying inside, letting them make fools of themselves while my neighbors watched this circus unfold. On day 4, I decided enough was enough. I had been planning for this moment for years, honestly. Every time I made a smart business move or closed a good deal, part of me was thinking about the day these people would come crawling back. I knew it would happen eventually because they never learned how to manage money properly. I went outside and Frederick immediately started his speech about how I owed them everything, how they sacrificed so much to raise me, the usual guilt trip nonsense. Melissa jumped in with tears about how they're struggling to pay rent and I have all this success that I should be sharing with family. So I let them talk. I wanted to hear their full argument before I responded. Frederick went on about how he worked 2 jobs to support our family when I was growing up. Melissa talked about all the meals she cooked and clothes she bought. They painted this picture like they were these amazing parents who gave me everything. Then I started asking questions. I asked Frederick why he took Rory to baseball games every weekend, but never once asked if I wanted to go. I asked Melissa why she bought Rory new school clothes while I wore hand-me-downs from Cousin Randall. I brought up every single instance I could remember of them treating me like an afterthought. Frederick got defensive and said they were just trying to help Rory build confidence because he was shy. Melissa claimed they were teaching me to be independent and resourceful. They had excuses for everything, but you could see they were scrambling. That's when I brought up my 17th birthday. I described that whole conversation word for word. The Warren Buffett comment, the bridge suggestion, everything. I watched Frederick's face while I repeated his exact words back to him. He tried to interrupt and say I was exaggerating, that he never said those things. So I pulled out my phone and played them a recording. Yeah, that's right. I recorded that conversation 6 years ago. I was 17 and getting thrown out, but I wasn't stupid. I had my phone in my pocket recording the whole thing because even then I knew I'd need proof someday. The recording was crystal clear. Frederick calling me 17 years of disappointment. Melissa saying I was a burden and a waste of their lives. Their laughter when I asked where I was supposed to sleep. All of it. The look on their faces when they heard their own voices saying those things was priceless. Rory went completely silent. Melissa started crying differently. Not the manipulative tears from before, but actual shame tears. Frederick just stood there with his mouth open. I told them they made their choice 6 years ago when they decided I wasn't worth keeping around. I succeeded despite them, not because of them. Every dollar I earned, every opportunity I created, every single thing I accomplished was done while they considered me a lost cause sleeping on friends' couches. Frederick tried to argue that they were young parents who made mistakes, that people change and grow. He said they realized they were wrong and wanted to make things right. Melissa begged me to consider that they're family, and family forgives each other. But here's what I told them, and I want you guys to tell me if you think I went too far. I explained that their current financial problems weren't my responsibility to fix. I mentioned that I knew Frederick had been laid off from his job at the warehouse 3 months ago and was struggling to find new work. I knew Melissa's retail job barely covered groceries. I knew they were 2 months behind on rent and facing eviction from their apartment. See, I had been keeping tabs on them through mutual acquaintances and social media for years. When you work in real estate and have connections throughout the city, it's easy to learn about people's financial situations. I knew their landlord through business circles. I knew Frederick's former supervisor. I had a complete picture of their declining situation. I told them I could help them find solutions. Frederick perked up immediately, thinking I was about to write them a check. Instead, I suggested Frederick could find work at the grocery store where I used to work double shifts as a homeless teenager. They were always hiring, and he could probably start at minimum wage within a week. I mentioned that Melissa could pick up more retail shifts, maybe at the store where Cousin Ellen works across town. The bus route runs there every hour, so transportation wouldn't be an issue. For their housing situation, I helpfully noted that Cousin Nancy had mentioned her basement apartment might be available soon. It's small and the ceiling is low, but it would be affordable on their combined retail wages if they budgeted carefully. Frederick's expression changed completely. He realized I wasn't offering charity. I was offering them the same kind of life they'd forced me into at 17. Minimum wage jobs, cramped living spaces, constant financial stress. Melissa asked why I was being so cruel, and I reminded her that she once told me never to contact the family again, that I was nothing to them. I was simply respecting her wishes by treating them like the strangers they declared me to be. That's when Rory finally spoke up. He said this whole situation was messed up, and that I should help them regardless of what happened years ago. He claimed he didn't even remember the apartment thing and said I was being petty. I looked at Rory and told him he was welcome to help them himself. He had been living rent-free in their house for years while working part-time at the pizza place. He could easily take on more responsibility for their bills. Rory immediately backtracked and said he didn't make enough money to support 3 people. I pointed out that I was supporting myself completely at his age while they were getting free housing, food, and utilities from Frederick and Melissa. The conversation ended when Frederick told me I had become a cold, heartless person and that they were better off without me. I agreed completely and went back inside my house. But you guys, they didn't leave. They're still coming back every day. And now Rory has started posting about the situation on social media, trying to make me look like the villain. Update 2. Okay, Reddit. Buckle up because this neighborhood drama has officially gone nuclear. You guys who said my neighbors would eventually get involved were absolutely right, and it's been wild watching how this played out. So after my confrontation with Frederick, Melissa, and Rory, where I played them that recording, they kept showing up every single day with their signs. My neighbor Ellen from 2 houses down finally approached me while I was getting my mail. She said the whole street was talking about the situation and asked if I wanted to explain my side. I invited Ellen and her husband Randall over for coffee and played them the same recording I'd played for my parents. Their reactions were exactly what you'd expect from normal human beings hearing about parents throwing their teenage kid onto the street. Ellen actually teared up during the part where Frederick suggested I sleep under a bridge. Word spread through the neighborhood pretty quickly after that. Turns out nobody was buying Frederick and Melissa's victim act once they heard the real story. Mrs. Nancy from across the street started giving them dirty looks when they showed up with their signs. The couple next to her began closing their curtains when my parents arrived. But here's where Rory's social media campaign really blew up in their faces. He had been posting on Instagram and Facebook about how his heartless older brother refused to help his struggling parents. He shared photos of them holding their signs, trying to make me look like some successful monster who abandoned his family. The problem was, Rory forgot that social media works both ways. I decided it was time to tell my own story. I posted the full recording on my own social media accounts, along with a detailed explanation of what really happened 6 years ago. I included screenshots of Rory's Instagram story thanking our parents for his apartment right after I got kicked out. I added photos of the grocery store where I worked double shifts as a homeless teenager, and my high school graduation photo where I'm standing alone because my family couldn't be bothered to attend. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People I hadn't talked to in years reached out to share their own stories about Frederick and Melissa. Turns out they had a pattern of treating people poorly when they thought those people couldn't benefit them anymore. My old coworker Bo from the grocery store commented about how Frederick used to come in and complain loudly about having a worthless son whenever I was working. A neighbor from our old street mentioned how Melissa would badmouth me to anyone who'd listen, calling me lazy and ungrateful while bragging about Rory's achievements. Even some of Frederick's former coworkers came forward with stories about how he'd constantly talk about what a disappointment I was, how he regretted having 2 kids, and how Rory was the only one worth investing in. The social media momentum kept building. Rory tried to defend them in the comments, but every response just made him look worse. When people asked why they threw me out at 17, he claimed I was rebellious and disrespectful. When pressed for specific examples, he couldn't provide any because there weren't any. Meanwhile, I was taking more direct action behind the scenes. Remember how I mentioned I knew their landlord through business circles? Well, I had a conversation with him about the situation. I didn't ask him to evict them or anything illegal like that. I simply explained that the people causing daily disturbances in my neighborhood were my tenants, and shared the recording so he could understand the full context. Their landlord was not happy to learn that his tenants were creating public spectacles and potentially damaging his reputation by association. He informed Frederick and Melissa that their lease would not be renewed when it expired in 2 months, and that any further public disturbances could result in immediate lease termination for creating a nuisance. I also reached out to some connections in the local job market. See, Frederick had been telling people he was laid off due to company downsizing, but I learned through mutual contacts that he was actually fired for poor attendance and attitude problems. When he applied for new positions, several potential employers contacted me as a reference since we shared the same last name and I'm known in the local business community. I didn't lie about Frederick's work history. I simply provided honest assessments based on what I knew about his character and reliability. I mentioned his tendency to blame others for his problems and his difficulty taking personal responsibility. These were factual observations based on 6 years of watching his behavior patterns. The job rejections started piling up for Frederick pretty quickly. Each rejection made him more desperate and angry, which made him even less pleasant during interviews, creating a cycle that kept getting worse. During this time, they escalated their sign-holding campaign. Frederick started arriving earlier and staying later. Melissa began approaching my neighbors directly, trying to convince them that I was a selfish son who abandoned his family. Rory started posting even more dramatic content on social media, including videos of himself crying about how his brother had become a heartless person. That's when I decided it was time for another direct conversation. I went outside while they were holding their signs and asked them to follow me to the park down the street so we could talk privately without involving my neighbors. At the park, I laid out exactly what I knew about their situation and what I could do to help or hurt them. I explained that I understood they were facing eviction, that Frederick couldn't find work, and that their savings were nearly gone. I mentioned that I knew Melissa had been asking relatives for money and getting turned down. Frederick immediately got defensive and demanded to know how I knew so much about their private business. I reminded him that when you live in the same city for years and work in industries that overlap, information travels. I had built a network of professional and personal connections, while they had spent years burning bridges and complaining about their problems to anyone who'd listen. I offered them one final choice. They could stop the public harassment campaign, take down all the social media posts, and work with me to find legitimate solutions to their problems. I would help Frederick find appropriate work, assist them in finding affordable housing, and provide some temporary financial support while they got back on their feet. Or they could continue their current approach, in which case I would continue sharing the truth about our history with anyone who asked, and they could face the natural consequences of their own actions and reputation in the community. Melissa immediately wanted to take the deal. She was crying and saying they were desperate and needed help, but Frederick was furious. He said I had no right to interfere in their lives and that what they did 6 years ago was ancient history that shouldn't matter now. Rory sided with Frederick. He said I was being manipulative and trying to control them. He claimed that successful people have obligations to help their families regardless of past conflicts, and that holding grudges was petty and immature. I told them they had 24 hours to decide. The offer was genuine, but it would expire exactly 1 day from that moment. They chose to continue the harassment campaign. Final update: Reddit. This is the final update, and honestly, I'm still processing how completely this whole situation imploded on them. You guys who predicted they'd escalate until they destroyed themselves were absolutely right. So when I left you last time, I had given Frederick, Melissa, and Rory 24 hours to choose between accepting help with conditions or continuing their harassment campaign. They chose harassment, and what happened next was like watching someone deliberately drive off a cliff. The very next day after rejecting my offer, they showed up at my house with bigger signs and started shouting louder than ever before. Frederick was yelling about how I was a disgrace to the family name and how successful people have obligations. Melissa was crying dramatically and asking my neighbors how they'd feel if their own children abandoned them in their time of need. But here's the thing about my neighborhood. These are working professionals who value peace and quiet. After 2 weeks of daily disruptions, people were getting really annoyed. Mrs. Nancy from across the street was the first to take action. She called the non-emergency police line to report a noise disturbance. When the officer arrived, Frederick immediately started his whole speech about family obligations and ungrateful children. The officer listened politely and then explained that regardless of family dynamics, they couldn't create ongoing public disturbances in a residential area. He gave them a formal warning about noise ordinances and public nuisance laws. Frederick got belligerent with the officer and demanded to know what law they were breaking by standing on a public sidewalk. The officer patiently explained that repeated loud demonstrations in residential areas could be considered harassment, especially when directed at a specific residence. He suggested they find other ways to resolve their family dispute. After the officer left, instead of taking the hint, Frederick decided this was all my fault for turning the neighbors against them. He started going door to door, trying to convince people that I was a heartless son who refused to help his struggling parents. This backfired spectacularly. Most of my neighbors had already heard my side of the story through Ellen and Randall. When Frederick started his sob story about sacrificing everything to raise me, Mrs. Nancy actually laughed in his face and told him she'd heard the recording of what they really said to their 17-year-old son. The door-to-door campaign made everything worse for them. People who might have stayed neutral were now actively annoyed by Frederick's pushy behavior. Several neighbors complained to the homeowners association about ongoing harassment from non-residents. Meanwhile, their own situation kept deteriorating. Frederick's job search wasn't going well, partly because word was getting around about his attitude problems, but mostly because he was spending entire days harassing me instead of actually looking for work or going to interviews. Melissa picked up a few more retail shifts, but it wasn't nearly enough to cover their expenses. Rory's social media campaign was also falling apart. The more he posted dramatic videos about his heartless brother, the more people shared my original post with the recording. His comment sections became full of people pointing out that his parents had literally thrown a teenager onto the street and laughed about it. Some of Rory's own friends started questioning him after hearing the full story. When he tried to defend Frederick and Melissa, by saying I was exaggerating or taking things out of context, people would ask him to explain exactly which part of the recording was out of context. He never had good answers. 3 weeks after rejecting my offer, their landlord followed through on his threat. The daily harassment campaign had continued, which violated their lease terms about not creating public nuisances. Frederick and Melissa received formal eviction notice with 30 days to vacate. This is when they finally came back to me, but not to apologize or accept help. Instead, Frederick demanded that I intervene with their landlord on their behalf. He said it was my fault they were getting evicted because I had turned their landlord against them by sharing private family business. I reminded Frederick that I had offered to help them find housing just 3 weeks earlier, but they chose to continue their harassment campaign instead. He insisted that my offer was manipulative and controlling, and that real family helps without conditions or ultimatums. Melissa begged me to reconsider and said they had learned their lesson about the public demonstrations. She promised they would stop the signs and social media posts if I would just help them avoid eviction. But Frederick immediately contradicted her, saying they weren't going to be controlled or manipulated by someone who should be helping them unconditionally. Rory tried a different approach and appealed to my sense of family loyalty. He said that regardless of what happened in the past, they were blood relatives who needed help, and that successful people have moral obligations to assist their families during hard times. He claimed I was being petty and vindictive by holding grudges over ancient history. I explained to all three of them that the opportunity for my assistance had expired exactly when they chose harassment over cooperation. Their current situation was the direct result of their own choices and priorities. They had spent a month creating public scenes instead of focusing on employment, housing, and financial planning. Frederick accused me of orchestrating their problems and manipulating their landlord and potential employers against them. I pointed out that I had never asked anyone to treat them poorly. I had simply been honest when asked about my experiences with them. Their reputation in the community was based on their own behavior and choices, not my influence. The conversation ended when Frederick declared that they would rather be homeless than accept help from someone trying to control and humiliate them. Melissa started crying and said she couldn't believe I had become so cold and calculating. Rory shook his head and said I had turned into exactly the kind of person they always worried I might become. That was 6 weeks ago. Frederick, Melissa, and Rory moved out of their apartment and are currently staying in a weekly rental motel on the other side of town. Frederick finally found part-time work at a fast food place, but it's not enough to cover even basic expenses for 3 people. Melissa is working 2 retail jobs now. Rory is still posting occasionally on social media about the situation, but most people have stopped engaging with his content. They stopped coming to my house after the eviction, but I heard through neighborhood gossip that they've been seen in the area a few times, apparently hoping to catch me outside so they can try to resume their campaign. My neighbors now actively watch for them and call me if they spot anyone from my family lurking around the street. The whole experience has been surreal, honestly. 6 years ago, these people threw me out with nothing and laughed about it. They spent years telling anyone who'd listen that I was worthless and disappointing. When I succeeded despite their abandonment, they showed up demanding that I fix their problems for them. When I offered to help them with conditions attached, they rejected the offer as manipulative and controlling. When their harassment campaign backfired and they faced eviction, they blamed me for their consequences and demanded that I solve problems they had created for themselves. I'm not going to pretend this has been emotionally easy. There's something deeply unsettling about watching people you once hoped would love you systematically destroy their own lives while blaming you for their choices. But I also feel vindicated in a way I didn't expect. For years, I wondered if I was being too harsh or unforgiving about what happened when I was 17. Maybe I should have tried harder to maintain a relationship. Maybe I was missing out on family connections that could have been repaired over time. But their behavior over these past 2 months has confirmed everything I suspected about their character. They haven't changed or grown. They still blame others for their problems, still expect other people to fix their mistakes, and still can't take responsibility for their own choices and actions. The 17-year-old kid they threw away became successful, stable, and accomplished. The family that decided he wasn't worth their investment is now struggling with the consequences of their own poor decisions and burned bridges. I'm not saying they deserve to be homeless or that I take pleasure in their suffering, but I am saying that their current situation is the predictable result of a lifetime of choices, attitudes, and behaviors that were always going to catch up with them eventually. As for me, I'm moving forward with my life surrounded by people who actually value and appreciate me. My real family consists of friends like Bo, who helped me when I had nothing, neighbors like Ellen and Randall, who listened to my story with compassion, and a professional network I built through honest work and genuine relationships. Frederick was right about one thing 6 years ago. I did learn what real life was like. It turns out real life is pretty good when you surround yourself with people who treat you with basic human decency and respect.